right. Here we go.
This
Good
meeting
morning.
is being recorded.
Oh, okay, cool. So we are on, if you're looking in your book, on page 464. If you're looking on the Kindle, I will share it momentarily. We are going to finish this section and this chapter, which is continuing the discussion of Kabana. So we're going to finish chapter 39 today, God willing. And just to bring everyone up to speed, chapter 39, continuing on chapter 38, was about the importance, what the value of Kabana, that it raises up our neshama to the highest of levels. We brought some beautiful explanations last week that when you have Kabana, the quality, the soul, the light shining in the soul is rising up to the infinite light, but also the soul itself is rising up to a much higher level, to a higher world. Usually our soul comes from the world of Yetzira or Bria, but through Kabana in a mitzvah, it allows our soul to be elevated, to transcend itself and reach all the way up to much higher. But to do that, you need to have a state of mental openness, not be in your state of bina, but remain in your state of chachma, which was I think, a very, very interesting discussion last week that we went into at length. So we are up to chapter 35 is where we should be up to today, and follow along inside on 464. And again, we're going to finish the chapter today, which is awesome. Here we go. When Kabana is lacking, and I'm just going to share the screen. Perfect. So far, we have discussed different levels of Kabana, which propel your soul and your mitzvah to the worlds of Yetzira, Bria, or Atzilus. Now we will turn to lower levels of attentiveness. So till now, we were discussing the higher levels of attentiveness, of Kabana, how high it could allow us to reach. But now we'll continue discussing the lower levels of Kabana, and to the extent where what happens if you don't have Kabana at all. Now, as we stated above, the reward for a mitzvah is a mitzvah. This is taken from the 4th chapter of Ethics of the Fathers of Pirkei Avot. It says, usually that means that when you do a mitzvah, it leads you to do another mitzvah. But really that meaning that from its reward, you can know the mitzvah's quality and level. Through the reward of what a mitzvah is, you see how high this mitzvah, the quality that the mitzvah is. In other words, from the spiritual destination where your mitzvah ends up, we can discern the kavanah you had when you performed it. So when you perform a mitzvah, how high does it reach? You could see from where it ends up, you could see the quality of what the mitzvah kavanah has on the mitzvah. And we shall not concern ourselves with things that are esoteric, namely the great tzadikim who are on the level of a chariot, who is unattainable, which is unattainable for most of us. We shall only discuss those things revealed to us, things towards which every person ought to aim. You need to have a profound recognition of the following. And just to give everyone just the basics of this statement, we know that this is the book called the Book of the Beinoni, the Book of the Intermediary. There was another book that was called the Book of the Tzadikim. The book of the Tzadikim never made it into our hands. The Alter Rebbe actually wrote a book for Tzadikim, but it was actually burnt. There was a fire in his home, and that was part of the manuscripts that were lit up on fire. There's other things also, but that was one of the big ones. And the Alter Rebbe understood, even though he put so much work into that book, he understood that it's not a book that is necessary or meant for our generation. The book that we have is the book of the intermediary, which is me and you that strive for that level of a Beinoni. That's what we have to work on ourselves on. So that's what the Alter Rebbe is going to focus on, is what what do we know from our kavanah and our mitzvah? What does it help for us? And that's where we're going to be describing, and he's going to give us, I think, a brief summary of what's to come. Let's see. First, the bottom of the page, Tanya will summarize briefly what we have learned so far about kavanah. The spiritual quality and level of your divine worship, if it's done with palpable reverence and love in your heart, which means when you're serving God with love and reverence, that results from cognition and recognition of the blessed infinite one's greatness. Then the spiritual address of such worship is in the 10 spheras, the 10 lights of Bria. And worship motivated by the inherent reverence and love, which doesn't excite the heart, but remains as a constant. In the mind, its spiritual address is in the 10 spheres of Yetzirah. Now we will turn to the main topic of the section, a mitzvah which is lacking in Kabana. Again, this will have various levels. So just to summarize one more time, if you do a mitzvah with love of God, and you understand that you have that reverence and love of God, which comes from the cognition, you recognize that this is a connection with God, and that leads you to do the mitzvah with love. That's the ultimate kavanah. It goes from your cognition to your heart, to your feelings. Then you're able to reach the highest of the three worlds, which is Bria. But if you do it only with the cognition of it, but it doesn't lead to this love and reverence, meaning it doesn't excite the heart, then it just remains in the mind. Then it remains in the world of Yetzirah, which is the source of where our souls come from. But now we'll go, what happens if you don't have that kavana? Let's see that now inside. A worship that is not motivated by reverence and love, not even consciously, as a constant in the mind. In other words, you didn't even awaken the love already dormant in your heart to bring it to light from its prior state of concealment, hidden in your heart, which means it's there in your heart, that you never brought it up. You never triggered it with any kavanah. You never arose this love that's there, and you just have to wake it up. It's staying sleeping during the mitzvah. You didn't even make it conscious.
I have a question.
Yeah, hold on. Let me just finish this paragraph. You didn't even make it conscious as a constant in your mind or in your hidden places in the heart at the very least. Rather, that love remains hidden in your heart as it was at birth, in the same state as before your worship. So again, we're talking about a place here that there was no kavanah at all. You did a mitzvah, but it never had any meaning. Simply what that means is, and he's going to go on to explain it in a little bit. Okay, yes, let's answer your question, but we'll see at the end of the sentence where this leads in your mitzvah when it's done without even that lower level of kavanah. Yes, Robin.
So my question is, to have full kavanah, you must go through Chabad, Bina, and Das. Is that correct?
Yeah,
so
Chachma, Bina, Das, exactly.
And you go through all three of those. So the way I can hold that in my mind is, I'm sorry, what was the first one? Chachma. I'm sitting here. I want to show God my love. I want to get connected. That's my chokmah. It just comes up. Want to be with God. Bina, how can I do it? What could I do? Let me get these books, Das, I'm sitting here reading and communicating with Hashem. Is that correct?
So I would say chachma is more the mental openness. It's not even about how could this bring me to a place of love. That's already, it's already with a goal over there. Chachma is more the faith in knowing that my connection to God is so deep, and you're open to whatever that brings you to. Now you want to continue that and analyze, what does it mean that I have this relationship with God that is so deep? That is the Bina process, the analysis, the dissecting of it. What does it mean? And then Das is more the personalizing it. What do I do with it? Now that I have that love, let me take that to the next level. That's where it develops the love, the reverence, the excitement, or the feeling of awe, which is from the heart. So Das is the link between the mind to the heart. Das is almost like the throat that connects the head to the heart, to the chest. That's the feeling of Das, where you're recognizing what it is, and now that triggers you into, propels you into the feeling.
Got it. Thank you.
But it starts with that mental openness, that chachma, that is the window to the infinite. Allowing yourself to go above you, to not just be limited to my ceiling, but to go above it. But now we're talking about when you lack that chachma, when you lack that kavana, what happens at that point? And we're going to learn some really interesting parts, especially in section 6. He really gets into it with a really beautiful teaching of teshuvah, which we'll get to by the end of today. So let's continue now. In that case, we're on the bottom of the Kindle page, and also the bottom of 465. In that case, your worship will remain below, in the world of separateness, also known as the superficial dimension of the worlds. As such, worship has not been empowered by you to rise and be absorbed in God's unity. Even in the 10 holy spheres of Asiya, the lowest of the worlds. So let me just go back a couple lines over here. When you worship God and you do a mitzvah, but it's done without the Kabana, it never ascends heavenward. It remains in a state of superficial area, superficial world. The sharp distinction between a world's sephiras, which are divine, and its superficial dimension, which is not, is explained by Rav Shneur Zalman in one of his discourses. So this is not part of the Tanya. The author of this translation, Rabbi Chaim Miller, is bringing it from a different discourse, and he explains it like this. In the superficial dimension of the worlds, since the time when they were created, something from nothing, the blessed infinite light has never shone there. For they were created to be separate. If you learn without Kabana, the breath of your speech and all the powers of your animal soul from Klippa's Noga only escape the physical world of 4 elements, but they remain in the chambers and repositories of the superficial dimension, very far from the light of God's face, as far as it can be. May God have mercy. So in short, we have this superficial dimension that doesn't shine that godly light. And when you do a mitzvah without kavanah, that's where you're that's where it's going. They remain in the chambers of superficial dimensions. So I know this sounds a little deep. I want to give a summary, but first I want to get through a little more. And there's a lot of good stuff coming up in this chapter soon. So I want to get us there. So as the Tikkun Zohar teaches, without reverence and love, a mitzvah will not fly upwards. It can't rise up and stand before God. It won't merge with the 10 spheras, stand before God in any world. The Tikkun Zohar did not state that the mitzvah was done with an inappropriate or selfish intention. It was simply lacking the emotions of love and reverence of God. The Tanya gives us a practical illustration of such an intent. This means that even if your worship was not completely authentic, which means it was shalom lishma, carried out for some ulterior motive, God forbid, other than worshiping God. Rather, it was in the spirit of the verse, the reverence of me is mitzvahs of men performed by rote, meaning that the worship was done out of habit you've grown accustomed to from childhood, that your father and teacher trained you and taught you to behave as one who reveres God and worships him. But on the other hand, your worship wasn't genuinely authentic, which means lishma either, because it's impossible for worship to be genuinely authentic unless there's a stirring of innate reverence and love, at the very least, to bring these emotions to light from their prior state of concealment in the heart. If not palpably in the heart, then at the very least in the brain and your hidden places in the heart. So obviously I want to go on and read the rest of the paragraphs, but in Yiddish there's an expression nishtahin and nishtaher, which means neither here nor there. In fact, actually in the Haftorah, in this week's Torah portion, which we're going to have on Shabbos, in the portion of this week, we talk about the sin of the golden calf. I'm sure we'll get a beautiful teaching of it from Nancy, God willing, on Friday. It's a very long story. It's the gravest of sins. So the Haftorah, which usually emulates and continues along the theme of the parsha, talks about in the story of the prophets when Elijah was rebuking the Jews and the false prophets who were worshiping other idols. But the wording that he says, there was a big showdown in Mount Carmel, of one of the famous miracles when a fire came down from the heavens and consumed the offering of Elijah on the altar. The famous words that Elijah rebukes the Jews is Ad Masai atem poischem al shtei hasifim. Until when will you be standing on 2 sides of the door? Which side are you on? Are you on God's side? Or are you on the idol side? So that's just the expression of nishtahin, nishtaher. Which side are you on? Make up your mind. take a stand. Over here, we're saying what happens if a person, he's doing a mitzvah, but he doesn't have an ulterior motive in mind. We're going to learn about that soon if he has an ulterior motive. He's learning because he wants to go to Disneyland, and his teacher promised him, if you learn, you'll go to Disneyland. So he's not learning for the sake of the Torah, he's learning for the sake of Disneyland. Or he's learning for the sake, if you're older, to be seen upon as the wise one or as the righteous one. That's an ulterior motive. But what happens if he's not doing it for an ulterior motive? He's just not doing it for the right motive. He's not doing it for God's sake, but he's also not doing it for any other sake. He's not doing it for this reason nor that reason. He's just doing it because that's what he knows to do. He does a blessing before food. Is he really thinking about elevating the food and the power of the blessing where it's taking his soul? No. But is he doing it for an ulterior motive? No. He's just doing it because that's what he's accustomed to doing. He's doing it out of rote, which is the wording we just said. So what happens to the mitzvah when it's done out of rote? Let's continue. So already we explained that it remains in the superficial dimension of the worlds, which means it doesn't ascend, it doesn't elevate. It remains in a place that's the superficial part of the worlds. Let's see that further inside. Because just as you wouldn't do something for your friend, is that where we're up to? Yeah, you're not doing that. Because just as you wouldn't do something for your friend to fulfill his will, unless you loved or revered him, likewise, it's impossible to do something authentically for God, to genuinely fulfill his will, without recalling or stirring your love and reverence for him at all. So if you really want to serve God authentically, there has to be a love there. If there isn't a love in your doing of the mitzvah, and you're just doing it without even thinking, the love is lacking, so it's not really authentic anymore. The genuineness of the mitzvah is missing. The mitzvah itself is missing. At the very least in your brain and your hidden places of the heart. And love alone, without at least a basic or lower reverence, is not called real worship. And this lower reverence is latent in the heart of all Israel. As will be explained below, that's going to be in chapter 41 and on page 502. So worship, which is devoid of any basic love and reverence, even if no ulterior motive is present, can't rise up and stand before God. So just to summarize that, we're serving God with no purpose, just because that's what we are trained to do. It can't be genuine, because in order for it to be genuine, there has to be a sense of love there. It has to be authentic. It's not authentic if you're not. So at that point, the mitzvah can't rise up. Till now, we were saying when you have Kabana, the mitzvah rises and rises, you see the spiritual address. But when you do a mitzvah without Kabana, it's not rising. The spiritual address remains stagnant down here. So therefore, that's how we started off today's section, where you could see the mitzvah from the reward of the mitzvah. So since the reward of the mitzvah, when it's done inauthentically, without any genuine feeling, it doesn't rise up. You could see what type of mitzvah it is. It's lacking in its fulfillment. So Robin is saying, I picture the rote mitzvahs as autumn leaves and piles on the ground, right? It's just remaining there, and it's waiting to get picked up, right? It's good. What if you, and which is what we're going to learn about in section 6, how you could still elevate these mitzvahs. What if you do a mitzvah for the love of God, even though your will doesn't want to? Oh, beautiful. Would it have meaning to choose to love God despite our own feelings? So I love that question, and it touches upon one of the deepest parts of study of Chassidus, where, and we touched upon this before, and the perspective or the opinions vary, but when you do something as a servant to a master, you don't love the master, you're just forced to do it. Is that a higher level of service than a child who's serving their parents? The child is doing it out of love. This is my father and my mother that gives me everything I have. You do it with love. You do it with respect. A master, you do it just because I have to. You serve him because that's what my job is. So to some degree, most people would agree that the level of the child overrides the level of this servant, because it's done with such intense love. But the fact is that the servant will do it because he's not doing it out of his will. He'll do it regardless of what he's feeling. So on a tough day when he's not interested, the child won't be doing it. And he'll say, oh, my father will understand that I'm not in the mood. but the servant will still be doing it regardless. So the basic summary is that this idea, just to quote your words, even though your will doesn't want to, and you're doing the mitzvah, that's I think the highest of levels, because you're doing it even though you're not interested, and you're doing it nonetheless. The only thing is, I think we're going to learn it in chat in section 6 over here. There still is some teshuvah that's needed, because ultimately you're not doing it with the real authentic love of why you're supposed to be doing it. So it doesn't have the ability to rise up to the highest of levels until you do teshuvah. So the next section is really, really a powerful section, I found, because it resonates with so many of us that don't do mitzvahs with Kabana. We do it with another motive in mind. We all, I wouldn't even say we're guilty of this, because it's so natural. You're studying for a specific purpose, because you need to talk on Shabbat, or you need to have what to share with this person, or you're not studying for the sake of the Torah. You're studying for a self-serving reason. So till now, the past section, we were discussing serving or doing the mitzvah for no reason at all, just because I'm out of rote, like the autumn leaves that Robin is talking about. But now this section, and that remains, the spiritual address doesn't really go anywhere. That remains in the superficial dimensions of the world. And we know, of course, when you do it with the Kabana, it's reaching to the highest of levels. Whether if it's from the Chabad that leads to the feelings, then it goes to the world of Beriah. And if it's done with that mental openness, like a tzaddik that's able to remain in that mental openness, it goes even to higher, into Atzilus, to the infinite. And if you do it just with in a place that it doesn't fully excite the feelings, it just remains in the mind, but you still have that Kabana. Kabana starts in the mind, right? It's a meditation. At least it goes to the world of Yetzirah. You go back to your source. But now we're going to discuss what happens if it doesn't, if it's done with an ulterior motive, because I want to go to Disneyland, or because it's going to make me look smart, or because whatever. He's going to give his own examples, so we'll see from here what happens to that mitzvah. And we're going to learn that through the power of teshuvah, it has the ability to rise up to the highest of levels. Let's see that inside. When an ulterior motive is present, and if your observance is completely inauthentic, which means shelo lishma, for some self-serving ulterior motive, such as studying Torah not to worship God, but to become celebrated as a Torah scholar, etc., then the ulterior motive, which is from klipas noga, becomes enmeshed with your Torah, and the Torah becomes temporarily exiled in the klipa. The failure to rise up and stand before God in section 5 is not the worst case scenario for your mitzvah. So again, one is you're not serving God in the most authentic way. At least at that level, the mitzvah didn't go up to God, but it didn't go down to klipa either. It remains in a spiritual, superficial level. But if you have self-serving motive, then temporarily your mitzvah will be trapped by klipa. That doesn't mean that klipa has control over your mitzvah. It just means that klipa hides the mitzvah's energy. So we're going to learn a beautiful topic here. So I just want to give you a little bit of background, explain what we just studied, and make it a little more palatable. Okay, cool. So just to explain this beautiful idea, there's different levels of Kabana. One is the highest level of Kabana. It reaches your soul to the highest of levels. One is a lower level of Kabana. Now we're discussing levels of no Kabana at all. One is that you're not really thinking much in doing the mitzvah. You're just doing it. So you don't elevate the light of the mitzvah, but it's not downgraded either. But now in section 6, we're talking about a pretty dangerous level where you're serving God with self-serving motive. So not only are you not elevating it, you're actually downgrading it. Because when you are self-serving, that's a place of klipa. It's not a very dangerous klipa. It's called klipas noga, which means it's not the klipa of the 3 klipas that are forbidden. It's the klipa that remains hanging in the balance but you're not raising it up to kedusha. It's remaining in a klipa state. Why is it remaining in a klipa state? Because it's self-serving. It's coming from almost an animal soul desire, because you have a selfish motive there, which we know the animal soul is a selfish being. It's what's making me look better, what's making me feel good. So if you're serving God for a self-serving reason, you're downgrading that light to a klipa level, because it's self-serving. So what happens at that point? So a story that I've shared before, just a cute little story of the Baal Shem Tov, that once I think he was visiting Turkey, and there was a beautiful big synagogue that they wanted to pray in with a minyan. And as they were getting into the synagogue, the Baal Shem Tov stepped outside and he says, I can't go in. And they asked him why, and he says, because it's too crowded in there. And when they asked him, what are you talking about? It's pretty empty. They barely have a minyan. He said, all the prayers that were said in there are stifling the room because they never had the power they were never elevated. It wasn't done with the love. It wasn't done with the reverence. It wasn't done with the joy that's needed in a mitzvah, in a prayer. And therefore it remains here, it remains stagnant. So over here, what we're going to learn is that it does have the power to be elevated through teshuvah, which means even a mitzvah that I did, or study of Torah that I did to go to Disneyland when I was 12 years old, it has the power to retroactively be elevated. Even though at the time it remained there, it remains in a klipa state, but we all know that klipas noga is able to be elevated, which is what we're going to learn here, has the power of teshuvah to be elevated, whether during my lifetime or even in another lifetime. That's where it's going to be a really cool part of this subject, that I have the power to elevate the mitzvah of my soul from a different generation through my performance of it now with the right love. So just see how powerful that is. My Kabana in a mitzvah now has the power to elevate a mitzvah that I performed 1,000 years ago during the generation of Egypt, that I did a mitzvah, but I didn't have much interest in it. Or I was in the time of King David and I just listened to what the king asked me to do and I prayed on Shabbat, but I just did it. Or I did it for the wrong reason. I wanted to be part of David's kingdom and his inner circle. So that remained stifled for 2,000 years, 3,000 years almost. And what we're saying now is you have the power to elevate it through teshuvah, through doing the mitzvah with the right love and intensity. Yes, Lynn.
So I just had kind of a funny way to look at it or think about it is, and maybe it could be done for Purim, is something that like Ghostbusters, we have Klipa Busters. So I was just going to ask you, what would be the Klipa Busters?
I love that. I love that. That's a great expression. That's a very good expression. So like, what would be, like, how would we, like, what would have to happen for us to elevate it? I'm pretty sure we're going to learn soon. It means doing that mitzvah with the right Kabana. But let's see, where are we? When I skipped the practice, let me just go back in this book. Let's see, I think that's what he's going to talk about inside now. It's going to be based on a very powerful Talmudic statement of how to go about it. So let's see it inside. But if we don't answer your question, Lynn, inside, let's discuss it more. So we're on the top of the page, or on 468, I think. That is, no, it's not 468 yet. All right, I don't know where it is inside. All right, let's just see it here. That is until you do teshuvah, which brings healing to the world. Since when you return to God, your Torah returns with you from Klipa. An interesting question here is, when you do teshuvah for prior worship conducted with an ulterior motive, thereby freeing that worship from the Klipa, in which it had become enmeshed, to what world does your prior worship now ascend? So before it was enmeshed in Klipa. Now I do teshuvah and I release it. Where does that mitzvah reach to? The answer is, it depends what motivated your teshuvah. If your teshuvah was motivated by intellectually generated love and reverence, the Torah will ascend to the world of Bria. But if the teshuvah was motivated by innate love and reverence, the Torah will ascend to the world of Yitzira. So it all depends on you. If you're doing it as you would have done a mitzvah before, So your teshuva now has that chachma, bina, das, that chabad propelling the feelings forward and higher. Then it goes to the highest of worlds, bria. But if it's just coming from that innate love, it's not really having those motivation of the chabad developing the feelings, then it will remain in the world of Yetzirah. And here's the famous statement of Talmud. Therefore, our sages of blessed memory taught, a person should always engage in Torah study and performance of mitzvahs, even inauthentically, for out of doing it inauthentically, he will come to do it authentically. That's a very famous statement of the Talmud. But the problem is, if authentic worship becomes enmeshed in klipa, why does the Talmud encourage it? Why say a person should always study, even not for the right sake, even inauthentic? You're putting it down in klipa. Apparently, the Talmud based its statement on the above point, that when you return to God, your Torah returns with you from klipa. So even if you're doing it now for the wrong reasons, you're doing it because you want to be looked at as scholarly, do it anyway, because eventually you're going to do teshuvah, and it's going to lead you, it's going to elevate those mitzvahs and that Torah study along the way with you. But the scary thing is, what if you don't do teshuvah? You're learning for the wrong sake, with the hope that eventually it's going to be elevated. But what if you don't do teshuvah? So let's see further. He's going to say that in a few paragraphs. Oh, he's going to explain it right here. So he's guaranteeing that you're going to do teshuvah, because it's either going to be in this lifetime or in another lifetime. And the Talmud reasoned that it's an absolute certainty that you will eventually do teshuvah, either in this incarnation or another, since even a banished person will not remain banished from him. That's a verse from Samuel from the book of Shmuel. In Hebrew, it's ki lo yidach mimenu nidach, that even a banished person won't be banished away forever. Everyone will eventually return. There's a famous song from Avram Fried, who's a Hasidic singer, who says, no Jew will be left behind, that no one will be banished forever. Eventually we'll all return. Eventually, it's a guarantee that our soul will do teshuvah. So even if you're learning now for an inauthentic reason, for an ulterior motive, and therefore the mitzvah is being enmeshed in a klipa, don't worry. Eventually you'll do teshuvah and it will be elevated. Let's see this next paragraph. It's not that the inauthentic worship rises to God. Actually, it gets trapped in klipa, but inauthentic worship is still worthwhile in the long run, because you will definitely redeem it at some point later on. And this is just notes on Tanya, which usually comes from the Rebbe, where he says, in this incarnation or another, doesn't necessarily mean another lifetime. It could also refer to a period when there are major changes in your life, which is awesome. And it's almost like you're a different person during the same lifetime. You're just reincarnated. Okay, so just to summarize this point, there's a famous statement. You know what, Chair? I actually can't, on a Kindle, I can't zoom in, unfortunately. So I apologize for that. So just to summarize, there's a famous statement from the Talmud that a person should study even if there's ulterior motives there, even if it's inauthentic, because eventually it will lead you to authentic service. So we all know that, right? You fake it until you make it. Some people say, I don't want to fake it. I'm a hypocrite. The Talmud is saying, do it anyway, because eventually you're going to do it for the right reason. So whether it's a kid studying because of the candy, encourage it. Eventually they're going to study not for the candy. They're going to see it. They're going to develop a higher level. But the question we have on this is, wait a minute, that's so dangerous. If you're studying for the wrong reasons, it's a self-serving reason, eventually it's going to be enmeshed in klipa. You don't want to do that. But he's saying eventually you'll do teshuvah, and it will elevate that enmeshment and elevate that Torah study, that mitzvah, to a higher level. How could you be guaranteed of that teshuvah? Because it's a promise from God that no one will not do teshuvah. Every soul will do the teshuvah, whether in this lifetime or another. Or like the Rebbe says, in your lifetime, you could be reincarnated, which means you change your style, your character, and that means within your lifetime, you could also do the full teshuvah and elevate that mitzvah to the highest of levels. So teshuvah has that power to go back in your history and elevate what was done, which is really cool stuff. We now turn to the lower level of inauthenticity mentioned above. There's a practical lesson that I would just like to go through. It's a long one. So this is on 469. And if you're looking inside, you can follow along, or you could just listen to me. It's 469 on the left bar on the column. A lack of kavanah can be rectified in one of two ways. If you had no kavanah at all, which means you just did it out of rote, then simply do the same mitzvah again with kavanah, and they will both rise up and stand before God together. So when you do the same, and Lynn, I think this is answering your question. When you're doing a mitzvah without kavanah, how could you rectify it? By doing the mitzvah with kavanah, then it elevates the second mitzvah you did with the kavanah and the first mitzvah that you performed without kavanah. Both of them go up. But number two, if you had a self-serving intent, then teshuvah is required to free the mitzvah from the negative forces in which you have enmeshed it. Ultimately, you should always be busy with Torah and mitzvahs, regardless of your kavanah. The kavanah can always be corrected later on, but you won't have this opportunity to do the mitzvah again. So which means this moment is not going to come back. So if you're going to work on trying to make sure you're doing it with the right kavanah, you're going to lose this opportunity. So do it anyway, even for self-serving reasons. And you're going to come back to it and release it from its kalipa and do teshuvah to raise it and elevate it to the highest of levels. Cool. Some powerful stuff. I really like this idea that you could always rectify what was done. We now return to the lower level of inauthenticity, which is the middle of 469 or the middle of the Kindle, mentioned above, where there is no kavanah, but no ulterior motive either, such as observance by rote. So we're going back to the first level. But if your worship is neutral, neither inauthentic nor authentic, then the criterion for your worship to be elevated to God is far easier. And it doesn't depend on teshuvah. Rather, as soon as you go back and learn this Torah with an authentic intent, then the thing that you learned with neutral intent will join with the current authentic study, and it will fly upwards together. Teshuvah is not necessary in this case because your neutral study had not yet become enmeshed with any klipas noga. So therefore, you don't need to do teshuvah because it never got downgraded to klipa. So it doesn't require teshuvah to release it. And therefore, when speaking of the lower level of inauthenticity, the mere absence of kavanah, we can clearly say that a person should always engage in Torah study and performance of mitzvahs, because in such a case, the damage is less. There's no enmeshment, and no teshuvah is required, just another Torah session later on with the correct intent. And the same is true of prayer without concentration. You simply have to pray again with concentration, and all your earlier prayers devoid of concentration will be elevated too, as is stated in Zohar, which I'll explain in a moment. So just this last point of prayer is what the story I told you about the Baal Shem Tov, which is really cool. A lot of times you would think if this person is praying without any kavanah, the prayer is worthless. The prayer didn't count. You have to do it again, which halachically is true. If you, let's say during the first verse of the Shema, you have to have a kavanah. If you didn't have kavanah on the oneness of God, on your faith in God, you have to repeat the verse. But what he's saying now is, don't think that saying it without kavanah, praying the words without kavanah is worthless. All it means is that it's waiting for you to do it with kavanah. What happens then is it takes your previous prayers and elevates it. So just to explain one more point over here, there's two elements, one worse than the other. When you pray with self-serving reasons, then that requires teshuvah to elevate it. But when you pray or do a mitzvah with no reason, which means nishtahin nishtaher, not for God's purpose, but not for my own purpose, you're just doing it out of rote, then you don't need teshuvah to elevate it because it never got enmeshed in klipa. All you need is to do the mitzvah with the right kavanah, study Torah with the right kavanah, and all your previous studies will be elevated. Or pray with fervor and intention and love. And when you do it that way, all your previous prayers will be elevated as well. But now he's just going to quote it from the Zohar. So let's just go back into that quote, which is not in the Tanya. All the Tanya does is he says, as stated in the Zohar. So the author of this English translation is nice enough to actually quote what the Zohar talks about prayer. So the Zohar teaches, this is a raw quote from the Zohar. If a prayer is not worthy, a chief angel pushes it out. So there's a sifter, there's a filter up there. A chief angel sees the prayer. It's not a worthy prayer because you were looking at your phone instead of in the prayer book. And he pushes it out. And it goes down and hovers about the world, standing at the lowest of the firmament below, which conduct the world. And in charge of that firmament, there's a chief angel by the name of Sahadiel. He takes all the rejected prayers, called invalid prayers, and stores them until that person repents. And if he properly repents before his master and offers another good prayer, then when the good one rises, the chief angel Sahadiel takes the invalid prayer and lifts it up until it meets the good prayer. Then they both rise up and intermingle together and go up before the holy king. So you just see the process. Don't think my prayer just disappears. The words of the prayer remain forever. It just gets hovered from the chief angel that is in charge of the prayers, puts it down to the lowest sky where there's the angel Sahadiel, and he holds on to that prayer until he sees the next prayer going up, done with the right Kabana, and then they both go up and meet at the throne of God. So let's just conclude with, I always enjoy this at the end of a chapter. We go through all the practical lessons that we read during the chapter, because in the Kindle, they just put all the practical lessons at the end. So it's just a good review without all the depth of the chapter, just getting what's practical out of it. So I really enjoy it. So in the Kindle, it's at the bottom of the page. If you're looking in your actual book, you're going to have to actually turn back pages to go through the practical lessons. But it goes like this. It's really important that you try to develop feelings for God through contemplative work in your mind, right? Kabana, starting with contemplation, which is chabad or chachma. That's because when you worship God based on ideas that you have acquired externally with your mind, you begin to transcend yourself, which is what Torah is, right? It's outside of you, but then you could reach a source, a limitless place, a place that's higher than you. You only transcend yourself completely when you rise above the tendency to process everything cognitively and can remain in a state of wonder and mental openness, which is what a tzaddik has, which is the level of chachma. That me and you, I think the example we gave, which was very powerful, I was sharing it after with Adina, that most times when we are listening to someone, we're already thinking, ooh, what does this mean for me? How could I respond to this properly? So you're not fully in a state of mental openness. You're already in the state of bina. So a tzaddik is able to stay in a state of chachma. So therefore, when they do the mitzvah, it's not about what is it to me. It's about the God in it. And that's the state of chachma that is allowing you to transcend yourself. But when you worship God, your soul can only ascend to one of the spiritual worlds, but your worship can ascend to God. So your soul, there's a chamber that it reaches. But the mitzvah itself, that is the light, and that could go even higher to infinity. But without reverence and love, the mitzvah will not fly upwards. It can rise up and stand before God. Rather, it will get stuck down here. A lack of kavana, and this is the last one we just said, can be rectified in one of two ways. If you had no kavana at all, then simply do the same mitzvah again with kavana, and they will both rise up and stand before God together. And number two, if you have self-serving intent, that's a little more complicated because now there's an enmeshment. There's the klipa that is involved because of your self-serving feeling. Then teshuvah is required to free the mitzvahs with the negative forces in which you have enmeshed. Ultimately, you should always be busy with Torah and mitzvahs regardless of your kavanah. The kavanah can always be corrected later on, but you won't have this opportunity to do the mitzvah again. So do the mitzvah regardless. Don't think too deeply into it. If you're not up to it, do it anyway, because eventually it's going to come back to you and get elevated. So a question that's coming in from Shira is Torah really outside ourselves? If it is Hashem's world and we are part of Hashem, isn't Torah within us? True. We are part of Hashem, and we are part of Hashem, and Torah is Hashem's word. Yeah, it is. So it's almost like we're related to Torah because we're both related to God, right? Is that imagine, if I have a cousin, I'm a cousin of a cousin. Does that mean I'm related to that other cousin? Right? A brother, like, I don't know how to explain this, but if I have a brother-in-law and someone else, I'm related on both sides, from my side and my wife's side, does that mean that I'm related to? Anyway, the simple answer is, I guess, yes, but with the caveat that we are higher than Torah. I'm learning a different mimer now. I don't want to get too deeply into it, but I guess we'll leave it at that for now. But it's definitely a good question. But the simple answer is yes, we both come from the same source. So Torah and the Jew is all one. And that's actually a quote from the Zohar that says God, the Torah, and the Jew is all interconnected. How do we connect to God? Through the Torah. So it's all connected for sure. Yeah, very good point. All right. Congrats.
I'm sorry. I was going to say I really enjoyed the timeliness of this lesson because I believe that it's in this parsha that we learn teshuvah. Is that correct?
Exactly, for sure. Yep. Nancy had trouble with her connection. She texted me, so she would definitely respond to that. That it's all about teshuvah. And in fact, the Talmud says, how could the Jews have done such a terrible act right after receiving the Torah? And the Talmud answer is, you're right. It couldn't be the Jews doing this. This was all orchestrated by God. God needed or wanted the sin to happen in order to teach us how to do teshuvah. That's actually how the Talmud words the sin of the golden calf, that it was all orchestrated from God. I mean, of course, everything is orchestrated from God, but this had to really be God's doing 100% because he needed to show us, to give the penitent the ability, the power, and we learned it from this week's Torah portion, which was the first teshuvah process in earnest by the Jewish people as a whole. Okay, very cool. So the good news is we finished chapter 39. We have one more chapter that continues Kabana. This is how my Kabana actually is able to create angels. So it's going to be a cool part. Chapter 40, if I'm not mistaken, it's another long one. But then we get to 41, which is a really, really powerful stuff. All right. Yeah, chapter 40 is definitely long. All right. So we have our work cut out for us. It's 20 pages. All right. I will see you all next week. Everyone, have a great day. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.